Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. I'm so excited that I have a hard time containing my excitement today with the guest that I'm going to introduce you to. As you know, we pivoted the podcast to really look at all areas of grief and loss and have more expansive, transformational stories of our experiences around people that we've loved and people that we've lost. And so today I bring to you a medium and a woman who is doing a lot of work now with families and parents around losses of their children. Her name is Deborah Hanlon, and I want to welcome you to this show this week, Deborah. And I want you to introduce yourself in any way that you would like to our guests.
Well, thank you so much, really, truly, for inviting me on and your very apparent energy and excitement. I sit here going, oh my gosh, people are excited to talk. I love that. I love to talk. So thank you. So I always laugh literally every time I'm introduced, wherever it is, introducing myself as a medium, because there's a part of me that is still, I do the inner eye roll at the word medium, which people don't understand, because I know there's a lot of connotations with what a medium is and what it isn't, what it could be, what it might not be. And I often say that I don't think I'd believe in it if I didn't do it myself, because I'm just not wired that way. So the mediumship stuff is a small word to define something so indefinable, completely just unbelievable ability to understand the nature of humans and what this is really all about in some degree, who we really are as people, and being that we're these energetic beings that are currently housed in a body, and our energetic self never dies. So to me, that makes me say, okay, I got to make the most of my now while I'm in the body. So mediumship is something that is it's so gigantic that it's hard to define and talk about and declare. Ultimately, it's taking the spiritual and bringing it into life versus only connecting to the deceased, if that makes sense.
I think that you really put some beautiful language to it. It's so hard to define. And I think that, you said you do the internal eye roll, and we have a lot of people that do the external eye roll, right? They hear medium and they're like, give me a break. Okay, so I told you that I'm sort of a medium junkie. I mean, so I've always had this incredible fascination of the afterlife, which in some ways I felt like prepared me for my brother's death in this very odd kind of way. I had read tons of books on the afterlife. I've always been fascinated. And then, of course, when my brother passed, I want to just backtrack for a second. My biological dad died when I was 10 months old. And I think that in trying to make sense of what that meant, I was, of course, a baby. But as I got older, trying to figure out what death meant, I think that's when my early fascination came. And then, of course, my brother died, and I started to do deeper reading and went to mediums. And so for people that have never heard the term and don't understand even the idea of us having a soul and energy and the afterlife, can you, I know it's a tall order, but can you try just to bring it down in a way so we're sort of on a level playing field where we have an understanding of the language that we're using?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are all these beings, and we get really stuck in the fact that we think we are who we think we are. So here I'm Deborah, I have dark hair, and these are my attributes. I have 3 sons. We all have our story, right? We all have our history, our story, our likes, our differences, and we believe that is who we are. And to a degree in this realm, that is who we show up as.
And I call that the ego, just to
That
give
is
it
the ego,
the
exactly.
ego.
In my
Mhm.
book, I called it the human self. This is my human self.
Yes.
And our human selves are limited, they're flawed, they're cranky, they're loving, they go through a lot of stuff, and they're capable of so much more. But we don't think that. Why? Because we're thinking about the Central Hudson bill or the price of gas, or we're worried about just basic stuff. And then a death comes along and then just blows everything up. So just on a regular everyday basis, we're struggling without any
I love that.
So, and then when we have a death, everything. It's like a hand grenade gets thrown into our lives and all the pieces get blown to smithereens. I personally think that's the gift, when everything gets blown to smithereens, but I'll talk about that a little later. But the true self, or what I call my higher self, is the self that is so much larger, sees the bigger picture, doesn't believe in limitations. There's no concept of impossible for the higher self, for all of us.
Some people call it our consciousness.
Our consciousness, our super consciousness,
Our
there's
soul,
our soul.
our higher being.
There's so many words for it. And basically, to me, it's our spiritual intelligence, our divine connection, whatever. I mean, there's so many words. When we die, the struggle dies, the limitation dies. The identification with that limitation is the only thing that dies. And it doesn't die and go away, it expands. We get expanded into a larger possibility. And we start to understand, like, oh my gosh, wait a minute, we are all connected all the time. We just have this illusion of separateness when we're in our human self, because I'm Deborah and you're Susan. And that's true. I am Deborah and you are Susan. And then there's another higher truth there that we forget about. When we die, we don't forget about that. We are in that truth.
And I love that. And so that's why I'm putting different language to it that our listeners might have heard. One is collective consciousness, to hurt you is to hurt me is to hurt you, because when we die, we are all one, right? Some of us have heard this. We've heard it in different ways. It's very difficult to wrap our mind around because, again, we're in our mind. We're in our identity. We're in our ego. We're in our limited selves rather than our expansive soul collective consciousness of what happens when we cross over. So there's a couple of things I want to say, and I'm going to backtrack. You said it was interesting that you used the metaphor of a hand grenade with death, because in my book that I wrote on sibling loss, when my brother died, I called the phone in my hand a hand grenade. And that when I had to dial my parents to let them know my brother had passed, I felt like I had pulled the pin because I was about to blow their world apart. So it's very interesting that you use that exact metaphor, because that is precisely what death feels like. And I think that when we think about our spiritual selves, it blows our world apart in a way that becomes unrecognizable, right? And so the way I think about it is that we have all of these pieces that are scattered on the floor, and it's our life, and we have no idea how we are ever going to put our lives back together again. And it's very difficult to understand that not only is it possible, but the transformation that can happen if we allow ourselves to walk through the pain of grief. So with that, I would love to hear from you. One, how this journey happened for you in becoming this human of mediumship, and also this work now that you're doing with parents. I'd love to hear the journey that has brought you to this place in time.
I was just talking about it this morning with someone, that I do believe that I was born on this planet with this natural need to know, what is this thing called life? What is death? What are we all talking about? What are we here for? Like, that was my only hobby that I ever remember. I just knew that there was something so much more than what the eye was seeing. And I don't mean that in like a mystical, spiritual way. I mean it in a very grounded, 5-year-old self way. Like, no, there has to be more. Like, why are we all running around so wild and crazy? But my opening, I believe, or my expansion started, I was 3 when my brother died, and he was 4. Yeah, so you keep talking about your brother. I'm like, yeah, that's what opened up my world.
Wow.
Yeah, and he had a rare childhood cancer, and he died. I was 3. So I was emerged in the reality of death and dying immediately on this planet. And the fallout that happened within my family as a result of it, I always feel that I was the luckiest one, because I was so young that I don't have conscious memories of life before. My brother's name is Christopher. Before Christopher's passing, so I don't cling to them as remember how life was. So I'm very fortunate in that regard. But that opened up, I watched how it affected my mom, my dad, my siblings, and it didn't affect them well. I was surrounded by healers and My mom was deeply into religious pursuits of all kinds across the board, from Christianity to Hinduism to you name it. She exposed me to it. And so I had a really well-rounded background of not a religion, but all experiences. And I think it's my natural inclination to want to know. So I was fostered really young, since the time I'm 3, about what grief is, how it works, how it manifests. I didn't experience my own grief over Christopher's passing until I was 19. At 19 years old, it came up. And I remember thinking, you're crazy. What is wrong with you? 16 years have gone by. You don't even remember him. So I do believe the energy of grief, it's got to move through us, and it will in the time frame it needs to. So that's a small part of my story. I very much love science and physics, particularly quantum physics and the nature of light and energy. And to me, that is the proof of the spiritual experience. So to me, science and spirituality are two sides to the very same coin. And that's how I approach everything I look at. What do I know to be true? And then how do I feel it? And those two together create this wholeness for me with whatever it is.
When did you start to know that you had a gift to be able to, every medium describes this very differently. Do you hear something? Is it symbolic? Like, how did that gift show up in your life when you were able to create that bridge between those who had passed and the messages for those that are still living?
Looking back, I think it happened all since I'm 3.
Okay.
In fact, I know it did, but I didn't know that that's what this was at the time.
Got you.
Knowing like, no, Christopher's fine. Christopher's still here. But it wasn't like I saw him at the end of my bed. It wasn't, I had one experience where we had a experience. I wrote about it in my book, but it wasn't like I talked about it like Christopher's sitting at the table with us. It was just a peaceful knowing that his presence is around.
Mm.
And I hadn't had many other deaths around me, fortunately, so it was really just him. It wasn't until 20 years ago, at the birth of my first son, 21 years ago almost, where I went to a funeral. And I'm at a funeral for somebody I did not know well. I was actually there to help the family members of the direct family members of this person because they had little children. So I traveled far to really help them, with their little ones while they were doing everything. And all of a sudden I could hear the woman, I could feel her. And I thought, because I had just had my son 4 months prior, I thought, oh my gosh, I think I'm having some sort of postpartum psychosis. I did not think, oh my gosh, I'm a medium and listen. I did not think that. I thought, oh my gosh, after this weekend, I need to get some help. So
I love that so much.
I could feel her. I could hear her. Someone would introduce me to someone and I would know like, oh, that's Mel. And then they'd say, oh, this is Mel. And I'm like, how did I know that was Mel? I don't know Mel. I've never met Mel before. Never heard the name. So it was a weekend full of that type of very evident, very immediate evidence. And I think she's talking to me. And I remember saying this to a family member who was related to them. It's my siblings' in-laws. And I said, I think she's talking to me. I think, and thankfully it was well received. I do go back to, thank goodness my sibling did not go, okay, you're out of your mind, you need medication. Thank goodness. But there was a lot of things all that whole weekend. And then there was a moment where I was sitting in a chair and there was a shelf behind me. And there was a picture of this woman her name is Barbara, with all of her grandchildren. And something kept telling me, I know about my face. Just tell them I know about my face. Every night I know about my face. That's the message I'm hearing. And it felt like something was touching the picture. And I'm like, okay, I don't know what you're talking about. And I kept turning around to try to get like, what's the deal with the picture? What's going on? And all of a sudden, her son came in the door and said to everyone in the room, see that picture there? And it was the one I had been focusing on. And he said, every night I kiss her face before I go to bed. That was the moment that I went, she is talking to me. She does. Oh,
I got chills.
It gets me every time. And I'm like, she wants him to know she knows. That was the moment that I realized, okay, Deb, you're hearing this. I don't know why. I don't know how, but you're hearing this and you're knowing this and you are not making this up. And that was the beginning of it all. I thought it was just her that I could hear. And then I started to just kind of test myself with friends and friends of friends. And I'm like, oh my gosh, wait a minute. I thought all these years, these thoughts and perceptions and visuals and things that come to mind, I thought I was just had a very active imagination all the time. Because that's what it feels like. And that's what it feels like for all of us. It's not just me. We're all mediums, every single one of us, because we're conscious beings. And we get data. I call it data. We get data all the time, but our human self filters it right out real quick because it doesn't make sense to our immediate experience. So we're like, if I'll be in the store and I'll think of Michael who broke his leg while skiing in Aspen, my brain will go there. And then I'll realize, wait, I don't know Michael. I've never been skiing. I've never been to Aspen. I know that that's not me. That has nothing to do with me. And this is a real example where I was on the store line and then I asked the woman in front of me, were you just in Aspen? Oh my God, yeah. And I says, did Michael break his leg? And the poor woman's so freaked out. But I needed to prove to myself, I'm hearing this. I don't know why. It doesn't pertain to my life. And here's the message.
Well, and I love that. And I like to call it intuition that we bat away, right? So the intuition can come very, very quickly. I call it our higher self, our soul, whatever language you want to put to it. And we bat it away because, like you said, it may not make any sense to us, that inner guidance. And then our ego kicks in, and then we can talk ourselves in or out of things all the time, right? And sometimes the intuition, I call it the gut response, can happen so fleetingly that we miss it or we don't trust it. So I love where we're going with this. Before we move into sort of how you began working with, groups, because what I really want to spend some time on is in talking to you is this humanness around the way that we process grief, because we know how debilitating it can be. But you said something that I want to speak to, that you didn't stop processing your grief until you were 19 years old. And in the work that I do on this podcast and with clients that I work with, that I call it delayed grief, but really it's not delayed, right? We deal with it when we're ready to. But I think that what happens in our culture is we are expected to move through our grief very, very quickly, which is why most of us are given 3 days of bereavement in organizations, which is ridiculous, right?
It's a crime.
It's a crime. And that I always say that I don't know what it is, but in the research and people that I interviewed for the book and whatnot, in my own experience, there's this weird thing that happened at this 4-month mark where I felt like I hit a wall. And then I ran bereavement groups, and that seemed like a common theme. And I sort of theorized that after all the busyness is done, you hit this wall of a pure exhaustion and this realization that this person that you love is gone in physical form. And then it can get harder before it gets better. Like I remember that 1 year mark and then that 2 year mark, because it takes a while for us to absorb the magnitude of loss. And especially when we feel like it happens too soon. I mean, I know that everybody dies exactly when they're supposed to, but we have this notion of this chronological order, even though rationally we know that's not true because we see young people dying all the time, but not in our life, right? I always hear over and over, a child is not supposed to die before their parent. And I'm like, according to who? Because that happens every day and we know that. We just don't want it to happen to us. Right. So I wanted to speak to that grief that you started to really feel that at 19, because what I will say, as my dad died at 10 months old, that our cells hold memory, right? Our bodies hold memory. What I'd love to venture into now is this idea of how grief can really debilitate us. We can, depending on our relationship with our beloved, the last conversation we had, we can get stuck. We can get stuck in anger. We can get stuck in deep guilt. Can you talk to us just a little bit about that experience and your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So we're talking about grief in the context of having a physical loss of
Yes.
someone's life. But, grief is that big loss of identity, of self, of the way life was. It could be a breakup. It could be a job change. It could be the pandemic. It could be, so grief is such a huge, huge, huge topic. We're talking in the more narrow or
Yes.
generalized, specific context. But, for anyone listening, because somebody might listen and say, well, fortunately, I haven't had someone close to me. This doesn't apply to me. And I would say, no, grief applies to all of us. We are
Yes.
absolutely all grieving all the time. But grief in this context, I love the idea of funerals. We'll start there. Because to me, funerals are for the living.
Yes.
It is that moment for the community of people to bring grace and love and energetic support to those closest to the person who passed. And that support, in my opinion, is what lifts them through those first 4 months.
Mm.
Because that support is surrounding. And, anyone who's lost someone in those first 4 months, they don't even remember what's going on. I don't remember. I wasn't even in my body. I call it go mode. I was just in go mode. And that is being lifted by the grace of the love and support of everyone who has come around, literally come around, or just energetically come around. So if you can't attend someone's funeral, but you send love energetically, that's that energy, which lifts the living. And then that starts to dissipate as everyone kind of returns to their own lives. And the main and most significant energies are completely obliterated. Obliterated. Why can't I say that word? Obliterated. So, and this is the part we all hate, but that moment is the moment, that moment of the hand grenade, that moment of hitting the wall, that moment of everything falling apart and the realization it's not going back the way it was, is by far the worst moment in our lives. No one will ask for it. No one. And yet that moment is the greatest gift you will ever receive. And you're not going to know that until much later. But I know with a fiber of my being that that event is opening you to a much larger potential and aspect of your human self. It is thrusting you and moving you forward to expand. The important piece is getting yourself into a truthful space of where you're at along the way to keep the expansion going. So what do I mean by that? When you're angry, be angry. When you're sad, be sad. When you don't want to talk to someone, don't talk to them. When you need people around you, get them. Whatever it is in the moment, whatever thoughts are going through your head, I shouldn't have done this, I should have done that, why didn't this happen, I'm so mad. All of that stuff, it's time to be really present with it and not allow yourself to get swept away by it, which is a very fine line. A very fine line.
Well, you can see I'm getting very emotional because when I've talked about this on the podcast, that I think the most terrifying thing when somebody that we love dies is that our life will never be the same ever. And like you said, it can be the greatest gift. Certainly people don't see it that way when it's happening. And like I said earlier, I think some people can get stuck. We want to run away from our grief because it hurts so deeply. And as I've said, you can't run from it. You can internalize it, and it can manifest in lots of different ways. Illness, anger, deep depression, because the only way through it is to feel it. And that feeling of it is where the expansion happens in my experience. And that takes a ton of grace to give ourselves that space because it hurts. And, and something else I talk about, you don't have to do it alone. You do not have to do it alone. And there is help out there. It may not be a therapist. Maybe it's a grief group. Maybe it's a pastor. Maybe it's a best friend, someplace where you can go and feel safe with those feelings and to process. I think what happens, Deborah, I've certainly heard this. It felt like this in my own life. As you said, people move on, not because they don't love us, not because they don't care, because they have a life that they need to return to. And we are left there going, wow, our world has stopped. And it can feel desperately lonely absolutely terrifying. And you use a metaphor on your website about a mountain to climb and I use that same metaphor in my book, that it can feel so daunting and so high that some people want to throw the towel in. And we know people have attempted to take their own lives. Some have succeeded because they cannot tolerate the depth of pain. Can we speak to this? Where does the hope come from for those that are feeling so desperately hopeless? And maybe this is the moment too to talk about parents losing a child, because I am working with a mom now that can feel like there is no deeper loss than a parent having to bury their child. Can you enter this realm with me and talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, and it's really hard to talk about because like talking about it outside of it, meaning not having the active griever here, I almost feel like I even sound insensitive when I say like it's the greatest gift ever, because I'm 1,000% positive it's also not. So
Yes.
I want to make sure that it's not like, oh, celebrate this great tragedy you're having. That's not what I
I,
mean by that at all. I just want to make sure people don't hear it, because I would want to punch myself in the face. If I heard someone say that in the midst of deep grieving. But it is an opportunity energetically for things to unfold. And it's the truths of ourselves coming up through grief, which is what grieving is. And we really meet ourselves at that point. And some of ourselves that we meet is not nice. There's parts of us that's not nice. We do things, we say things, we think things that we never thought we would do, say, or think. And all of a sudden now we're like, who am I? I'm a monster. And now you're a monster. And the psyche does so many different things with this whole process. So that's why I say staying truthful to whatever you're feeling and thinking. Yeah, you're not the only one who's ever thought or felt that. You're just not. Talk about it, because it enters into a realm of almost being, when I say funny, I mean, it's almost like, oh my gosh, you mean we're all crazy? Like we all have these crazy thoughts and feelings afterwards. And, yeah, we do. And we really need to talk about those things, because it's not just about like journal your feelings and, let's talk. There's so much more, because that's still surface. The deep stuff is, once I found out so and so passed, I, threw a glass across the wall and shattered it. And now I have, this propensity to want to take out my anger in other ways. That's the real stuff that really happens. Or I decided to stay in bed for 4 months and I ignored my other children. That's the real stuff that people are really holding on to, the guilt there that they can't even talk about. So they'll say, I'm really sad because I miss my child. But it's also, and I feel like a horrible human because I X, Y, and Z. So we want to go deeper and deeper down into those layers of what's really going on, because I promise you, you're not the only one. You're not the only one to have a thought, well, why couldn't it have been so-and-so's child? Which is a terrible thought, right? So we think it's not really a terrible thought. People have these thoughts. Why did this happen to me? All of those little idiosyncrasies that we just don't lift up off the page of ourselves. That's the stuff that I want people to hear is normal. And that's the stuff we need to share, get up, get out, see, yep, yeah, that's real. That's true grieving. That's it right there. That's the work I do in my groups, where we're not surface talking. I mean, yes, we are. It's there. But it's the space to go deeper and deeper and deeper down. Yeah.
We've heard the metaphor about peeling back the layers of the onion, right? Because that surface feeling, we call it the tip of the iceberg, right? Because there are so many different levels, as you have said, and it can be ugly. It can be, I use the word terrifying because that comes up a lot in grief. It's just the whole thing is so scary. People clip people out of their lives. A lot of the BS is stripped from our life. Somebody who wasn't great with boundaries all of a sudden has become this boundary person, right? Where they're like, I don't have any time for these things that used to suck my energy dry because I'm doing everything I can to survive right now. We have
Those are
this
the gifts that I'm talking about. Those are those gifts.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
That
those
you emerge. Yeah.
yeah. And what really matters, I mean, I think that what I love so much about bereavement work is that you really are when you meet each other, there is no, what's the word I want to use? There's just nothing superfluous anymore, right? It's like you feel like you're best friends because you're meeting at a place of raw honesty of what really matters, and everything is stripped away. And when everything is stripped away, you feel naked and raw. And like you said, the guilt that I carried over my brother, some things that happened with us that I wrote my way through. Because when you're writing, and as you said, it's not just a journaling, I call it a deep dumping down that takes a while to get there, where you really are going so deep that what is below the guilt, what is below the anger, because the death is bringing it up, but that is not the source of the guilt. There is something so much more that you are being asked to look at. And that is exactly what you are trying to say, I know, around the gifts and the truth of who we are, because we are flawed human beings and we are beautiful, perfect souls too at the same time.
When in our truth,
In
that's
our
what makes
truth.
it so beautiful. Yeah, when we're real and we connect. Nobody connects really. No one truly connects on the superfluous anything ever, anywhere. Look at social media. No one's really connected there. In fact,
Right.
I will see something and I'll be like, oh, please, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like I'm being so rude right now about something that has nothing to do with me. And that's a truth, that it's like not connecting on superfluous. But the deep, raw stuff, we all connect there. That's the
Right.
true stuff, the vulnerability. And
The
I find
shame, the deep
shame.
shame.
That's what I was writing, that this brings up so much shame over so many really big things and so many really little things. The mom who, didn't pack the lunch the morning that her child passed, can't get over the fact that she didn't pack the lunch. That's what we want to get at, that stuff, so we can lift it up and look at it and say, yeah, that's okay. That's totally okay. Or I yelled at them because he didn't put his shoes on fast enough. Or, yep, just like every billion other mothers did that morning. Just the stuff, the real stuff. And to me, as a medium, where people think a medium connects with the deceased, the way I see it is that I can help bring life back to the dead parts of the living through mediumship.
Can you say that again? That is so profound. I need to actually write it down. I've never heard anyone put it that way. I think it's one of the most beautiful lines I've heard. I'm a writer, as you know, so please, can you please say that again?
This is how I see it. Everyone thinks that the medium is connecting with your loved ones and kind of bringing life back to the deceased, but we are bringing life back to the dead parts of the living because of the death of a loved one.
Oh, wow.
That's what we are doing. That is what we are supposed to be doing. Let's put it that way.
Okay, we've only got about 10 more minutes, and I really need to linger here. People hear me say, because there is something I'm going to have to unpack, that I think that we're bringing life back to the dead parts of the living. Please, can we go deeper into what this means? I love this so much. I almost have no words for it.
So when someone dies, the piece of our identity that is connected to them, whether it was day in, day out as a parent, as a spouse, as a child, whatever the dynamic is, when that physical being dies, there's a physical void that happens in the remaining living. That's the void we're looking to bring life back to within the human self that's still here. The deceased are fine. I always say they've got the good stuff.
No, they're psyched. They're home. They're happy.
They're connected. They're not experiencing death as a separation. They're experiencing death as a complete connection, complete opposite of what we're going through. So it's that dead part, that void that's left within ourselves, that a medium is going in and working with that to bring life back to the living. When grief is the energy of death within the self, not because someone died. It just happens to be brought up when someone dies.
On that note, I'm so speechless, because you're hitting something that I've been trying to put words to in a way. Literally, I feel like I'm going to meditate on this for the next week. we need to just go a little bit deeper with the time that we have left. So let's make this super tangible. Okay. So let's talk about sibling death, because one thing that we know is that when a sibling loses a sibling, even if they're estranged, it has a huge impact because it literally feels like you're losing a limb. Then we've got siblings that are sisters or brothers, and they are very best friends. And they not only have lost a sibling, they've lost a very best friend. And I've heard this over and over. They literally, don't know who they are anymore. And they have no idea what to do with themselves. And of course, this is true for a parent losing a child. I do think it is a different loss when siblings lose each other. And I also think it is not talked about enough, because when a sibling dies, everyone is concerned about the parents or the spouse and children. If the sibling was old enough to have a family, and the sibling, the way I like to say is they sort of suffer in silence and feel like they need to be strong for everyone. And they feel incredibly lost and on an island by themselves. Let's go to this place around what you're talking about, the dead parts, and relate that back to the sibling who feels like they literally have lost the other half of who they are. Can you
Yeah.
speak to that a little bit?
I love that you are really putting so much for the sibling population, because you're so right. You're so right. It goes to the parents, it goes to the spouse and children, and the sibling, especially whatever the dynamics of the family were, usually the sibling will pick up and become the parent to everybody. So yeah, that's a super heavy, a very different alone role for sure. The sibling is losing their past, is what it feels like. It's not true, but it
And their future. There's a saying that says, when a sibling dies, the parent loses the past, the spouse loses the future, and the sibling loses both.
yeah, that's amazing for sure. And so we have to look at the individual person, yourself, the sibling self, of what part of my history am I telling myself I'm losing? Because the history is still there. Everything is as it was in the past. And in the now, it's a real challenge of who we are now in relation to, there's no void of the future. It's a void of the future with that person, of course, but there's not a void of who you are, because who you are, you've always been. We could be in a completely dark room alone by ourselves, and we're still there. And so it forces us to go inward of like, who am I now moving forward? And with a loss of this companion. Does that make sense?
It does, because what we're trying to cover is so much and it's so big. And I think that it really also, the way everyone's going to take this conversation a little bit differently based on their own beliefs, their own experiences. So I always think about, myself in that darkest place, and where I am now 8 years later, and how my brother's death has, well, his death transformed my life in a way that I could never have anticipated. And because I believe in the afterlife, I pay attention to signs that I get from him all the time. And now my mother too is passed. And so I'm very open to those signs. And things that I've read and heard is that it is very difficult for us to recognize the signs if we don't believe, obviously, but also if we're in deep grief, it's hard for them to get through. So we only have a couple of minutes, and I feel like this is such a much larger conversation, but can you leave our listeners with maybe something tangible to hang on to, or to try, or something that they can do if they are in that place of really facing themselves in a way that is terrifying because they are still in acute grief?
I mean, I don't know that there's that stock answer, because it's going to be different for everyone. So that's one, is to recognize, just to see where you're at, but definitely know that you're not unique, which people hate to hear, but when it's grief, you're not unique. Whatever you're thinking, feeling, doing, whatever rash decisions you want to make, whatever is going on, that knee-jerk reaction, because that's the brain's way to protect, right? The minute we're feeling such grief, the brain is not processing it as an emotional event. It's processing it as a threat happened. And so it creates all this firestorm of, I've got to do something. I've got to this, I got to that. So observe yourself, slow yourself down, just watch what you're thinking, doing, being, behaving, what you want to do. All of a sudden this person died, now I want to divorce my spouse, like where those two were not connected, but all of a sudden we just have all these different, like, I need to change everything in my life. Bring yourself back to this moment and just feel, even if
Mm.
feeling is numb. Even if there's an I don't know what I'm feeling. I always tell my students that I don't know is an answer. When we say, like, how am I feeling? I don't know. Then that is the feeling. I don't know. So really get into wherever you're at, even if it's an I don't know where I'm at. And just hold out the hope, even though you can't, that as you're working and diligent on your grief, there is something so huge waiting for you on the other side of it. That, like you said, your brother's death expanded your life in a way you never could have imagined. That's the gift that I'm talking about. So it's not a gift we ask for. It's not one that we say, gosh, wow, I really hope I go through this tragic event so that I find myself. I wouldn't want to find myself if I have to go through a tragic event. So no one will ask for it. But just know that that is the natural outworking of it. It just is. And so we want to work on it and be present with it in each moment to get there.
And that I think is the absolute pinnacle of what we mean by self-love, right? I always ask at the end of the podcast, what does self-love look like? And in the grief journey, self-love is holding yourself in the most gentle, loving way for anything, all the darkness that shows up in our perfectly flawed humanness.
Yeah, the darkness and humor.
Yeah,
I
humor.
find I think humor is really important because I think there's so many times where, I mean, so many times in a single day where I step back and I observe myself and I'm like, what are you? You're nuts. This is ridiculous. Like, why are you getting so angry over, my coffee just spilled or, just silly things? And I laugh. So I think that with holding ourselves with compassion and love, but also with a real sense of humor, because
Yes.
we're all silly, we're all ridiculous, we're all nuts. And I mean that in a loving way. I don't mean it like in a psychological way. We're all have these wild things that are going on within us that let's approach it with truth, with authenticity, with realness, with what's really going on versus what we think should be going on. So the humor piece is the ability to laugh at ourselves because we can't get out of bed. To be able to look at like, wow, I really can't. And I feel that that's so much more doable. Like, yeah, then don't get out of bed, but definitely like see yourself in bed.
Yeah.
Honor
Yeah.
it, but see yourself in bed like, wow, yeah, because someday you will go, wow, I can't believe I literally couldn't get out of bed.
Well,
And then,
I was telling a girlfriend I literally didn't take a baseball hat off for 4 months. And my husband's like, are you ever going to take that hat off? I'm like, I don't know. Because I didn't even have the energy to do anything. And so the humor is so huge. And I have this saying, well, it's not my saying. I mean, people have heard it, like, take your work seriously, but take yourself lightly. And we are at the top of the hour and we have to end. So I want to say before we say goodbye, I want to thank you from the depths of my own being for being here with us. And where can people find you? We'll have all of your channels and your website in our show notes, but your Instagram channel, where can
yes,
people find you?
Instagram is at I am Deborah Hanlon, like I, the letter M, Deborah Hanlon. But DeborahHanlon.com is where you can get wherever I am, Facebook, Instagram. If people want to attend a weekly live Zoom meditation class, they can email my office and we'll send you a trial code to try that. That's super intense, amazing.
I'm going to try that.
Oh, please do. You will love it. It's a channeled experience. And then we have a group discussion of the experience afterward on Zoom. It's just a fun, insightful, deep, silly, real. I mean, you name it, it's all in it. So those are on Sunday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern time.
Oh, Deborah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for giving us this time, to me and all of our listeners. And thank you, listeners, for giving us the time as well. And check out the show notes and connect with Deborah. I highly encourage you all to. She's up to lots of different things. So please jump on her website. And thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.